Ayacheke, Wesley Leonard Waynesville Ane. Hello, everyone. I'm Wesley Leonard. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you from my home in Riverside, California. I'd like to acknowledge the Kuya and the Tongva peoples on whose lands my home is built, and I extend to them my appreciation for allowing me to be here. I feel very privileged to have the opportunity today to be joined by a group of co-resistors, language warriors from many Indigenous nations, along with non-Indigenous allies who actively disrupt the status quo, as we all engage in a praxis of Indigenous inclusion and share some associated insights and examples. It's also very empowering to me to witness the momentum of the Natives for Linguistics project, which I co-developed with many of you several years ago, and the many things that came out of that initial workshop we held in 2018 at the LSA and SCILA meeting in Salt Lake City. My commentary is anchored in a growing recognition within language sciences, particularly in linguistics, about how disciplinary goals, methods, expectations, norms of training, norms of mentorship, and so on, tend to serve to privilege people of certain backgrounds and their needs in their ways of knowing. This contributes to exclusion of others who in turn feel mistreated, unwelcome, pressured to set aside their own backgrounds and knowledge systems, or even exploited. And thus are called upon to move away from language sciences even when they were initially enthusiastic about them and came with good ideas. There's a widespread and, in my opinion, very well warranted critique about interventions that address the problem I just described. Too often, these interventions focus on increasing the number of bodies, people with a given trait in a given field. In this case, sort of having more Indigenous people in linguistics, and do this without changing the structures that contribute to the exclusion of those people in the first place. I facetiously refer to this assimilatory model as taking linguistics to Black and Brown people, teaching them, that's keyword them, members of the othered group, how to be like us. And when I say us here, I'm not using the regular pronoun, but in fact, I'm thinking more of a proper name that refers to a particular brand of academic linguists. To be certain, even a problematic assimilatory approach is going to have some positive effect, compared to having no approach whatsoever. And of course, when some of us do enter the field, even if it's not particularly inclusive, our presence is meaningful, and we have ideas and we act upon them. This noted, I think that the papers in this symposium represent better and needed approaches. I observe that they collectively show how Indigenous presence, even when the numbers are high, and they usually are not, but sometimes they are, is not the same as inclusion, and they provide pathways toward actual inclusion. This then raises a question of what do I mean by inclusion? So I've provided here a basic summary of my thinking. Indigenous inclusion entails creating, implementing, promoting, and supporting approaches that respect Indigenous needs and values about language and research. By extension, then, the increased presence of Indigenous people in language sciences, the higher numbers, if you will, represent an outcome. The increased presence is not the goal itself, but rather is an outcome of the goal of inclusion being realized. I hope that this statement is straightforward, but I recognize that it also contains somewhat ambiguous concepts, Indigenous needs and values about language and research. We've heard in today's presentations a number of specific examples, and for the sake of time, I won't repeat those, but instead I'm going to collapse them into a more general summary, which might be stated like this. Indigenous research and teaching methods support Indigenous inclusion. There's a convention in Indigenous studies, and it comes out of education. It's also particularly used in education today and in Indigenous education specifically, of featuring words that start with the letter R, which happen to capture these Indigenous protocols quite well. These words include respect, especially for communities and their ways of knowing, relevance, language work needs to be relevant. Reverence for languages and how they come from particular places and peoples. Reciprocity with respect to intellectual and material resources in particular. Responsibility, including that which comes from the social positions that a person occupies. Rights, particularly as sovereign language communities, to make decisions about their linguistic futures. These, along with additional R's that I don't have in the slide, revolve around what I think of as a more central concept, relationality. The notion that everything is interrelated and by extension interdependent. This concept of relationality in my mind automatically implies the associated accountability, but the term relational accountability is also a named idea in Indigenous studies, so I've included it here. Relationalities goes hand in hand with the concept of holistic approaches to the world, a theme that calls for respecting how languages exist in complex social contexts and are often intimately tied to peoplehood, cultural norms, places, wellness, and spirituality. Language work that severs those relationships or diminishes their value is decidedly not Indigenous and very, very exclusive. Moreover, a general important theme here is that each individual R around the peripheral parts of this circle must be informed by and responsive to the others. For example, responsibility in language sciences is anchored in respect for the people who produce or hold that knowledge, along with their ways of producing knowledge and sharing knowledge. In academic contexts, this entails, among other things, that Indigenous ways of defining language, of studying language, and of doing language work must be embedded within a given program, activity, or institution, whether this be individual linguistics classes or research experiences, larger degree programs or certificate programs or related types of training, the parameters of how partnerships for language work are developed between organizations, grant programs with respect to how they're set up and what kinds of work they fund, as well as how they do outreach and provide support so that Indigenous-centered work can be successfully funded. Also emerging from today's symposium were several other important themes, of which I'll highlight a few. First, and very important, is that inclusion is active and intentional. Let's be very, very clear that the Academy is not set up around Indigenous protocols. In fact, it's largely the opposite. And when certain ways of being and certain ways of doing are very, very firmly embedded in a given institution, changing those requires a lot of work. It does not happen accidentally because structures tend to reproduce themselves. By extension, then, inclusion must be active and intentional. We must talk about it, think about it, and so on as we're doing it. And Indigenous inclusion in language sciences, by extension, then requires transformative change. I recognize that it's possible to do incremental changes which can collectively work toward transformation, but I think it's important that we think about transformative change, as the ultimate outcome. Inclusion also requires interventions in diverse institutional contexts and in all stages that one goes through in language work, whether that be to become a linguist or to do other types of linguistics. Today's presentation, I think, captured this point quite well. Today's presentations, I should say, captured this point quite well by illustrating very different but related stages, being an undergraduate, functioning as an early career faculty member, getting grants to fund one's work, and so on. All of these areas must be inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing. Important theme is that Indigenous strengthens and expands linguistics. And this is true for inclusion across the board. And of course, today's symposium was specifically about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous language work, but this general point applies more broadly. And finally, it's important to recognize that inclusion is an ongoing process. It's not something that happens overnight. I observe here, that exclusion has taken place over a long period of time. And so perhaps sort of inclusion, by extension, is going to also sort of take quite a bit of effort, but I'm very, very empowered by what's already happening today. So on that note, So I bid you well and offer you big thanks. Mishinewe.